I'd like to take you through this quick vodcast on hindsight bias. Remember, you can pause me at any time, okay? And you probably will to have to write a few things down. I'd rather you pause and write as opposed to just write and stop listening. Okay, in this column over here, we have different definitions. At least the first two are different definitions of what the hindsight bias is. I always find this a very, very handy way just to remember it and not to get confused, say, with the confirmation bias or even other type of distortions of thinking, which are biases. That's what a bias is, a distortion in our thinking, like overconfidence. But the hindsight bias is that I knew it all along phenomenon. In this column, what you're going to see is in numerous psychology books, this is where the hindsight bias often appears. It often appears in units on cognition that are talking about biases. Remember, like heuristics and algorithms, like ways we think. It often shows up also on some units in memory. So for instance, this definition right here is actually from a textbook that puts the hindsight bias in the memory unit. Myers and the Barron's Review actually put hindsight bias in the research unit. And this is pretty important because on numerous FRQs where the hindsight bias has appeared, it's appeared on a few, I should say, I think 1 or 2 times it's appeared. It's usually connected to research. Now, you have to listen, you have to read the context of the question. But what I can tell you is one of the reasons why hindsight bias appears in research units is because what they're trying to get you to see is that when we engage in the hindsight bias, which is a tendency, what happens to the research we hear? Well, we're less surprised by the research findings. We think because we think we already knew those research findings, or we could have easily used our intuition, this word right here, to figure out. And by the way, they've done numerous studies on this with things that are where they purposely misinform people. I'll make one up for you that I don't think they've ever gone this ridiculous, but it could be something like where they tell people, well, nutritionists have figured out that actually eating 5 chocolate ice cream sundaes, in a 2-week period actually help people become healthier. And then people are like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I can see that. There's milk and there's protein. That kind of makes sense. And, maybe if you're eating ice cream, you're more likely to do, so people will actually try to justify the findings and say, I knew that all along. But the key is they're not surprised by the research findings. This is the key. Okay, what does it have to do with again? It has to do with the idea that if we often mistrust our intuition, and psychology is a science. And the whole idea is that we can't just simply rely on our intuition because it actually can sometimes mislead us. The other thing that's important, so intuition, the other thing that is important is the hindsight bias gets in the way of this. We have to learn from experiences. If we thought we already knew the outcome, we're actually not taking this new information and making it a part of our cognitive repertoire. And so therefore we're not literally learning from research. Okay, so this is really, really important. The whole key for psychological and scientific research is for us to integrate that new information, which may be even shocking at times, or differing from what our intuition might tell us, and incorporating that and making certain changes. So this is the key to the hindsight bias when we're talking about research.